Ruth, we've talked about this. The room is Kevin's now. You knew this wasn't permanent. We thought you understood that. The suitcase wheels made a small sound on the hardwood floor. The door closed behind her. Not a slam, just a close. The particular sound of a decision that had already been made before anyone said a word about it. Ruth Alderman sat in her car in the parking lot of the Greenfield Supermart at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in September. The lot was mostly empty, a few cars near the entrance, overnight stalkers. Fluorescent lights washed pale across the windshield, and she sat in that cold light without moving. She was not crying. She was looking straight ahead through the glass at nothing in particular, the way a person looks when they are waiting for something inside themselves to settle. She had nowhere to go before morning. So she lowered the seat, pulled Dale's old coat over her knees, and prepared to sleep in the car. In her lap was a key, old, brass gone dark, tied with a length of braided cord that had once been red and was now a soft, faded pink. Vera had pressed it into her hand in 1994 at the kitchen table of the farmhouse on County Road 7 and said, "This is my house key. Yours too if you need it." Vera had not explained more than that. She rarely explained more than that. Ruth closed her fingers around the key. Outside, a truck moved through the far end of the lot. The engine sound faded. The night went quiet again except for the distant hum of the store's refrigeration units running behind the wall. Ruth Alderman had spent 50 years being the kind of woman who made things easier for everyone around her. When her husband Dale got sick, she managed it without asking her children to rearrange their lives. When Dale died 3 years ago, she arranged the funeral, wrote the thank you notes, sorted his belongings on her own timeline, and told Marcus she was fine because she mostly was, and because telling him otherwise would have required him to do something. 2 years ago, when Marcus came to her with the numbers, the business debt, the second mortgage he had taken without telling, Brenda Ruth sat at his kitchen table and listened. Then she said, "I'll sell the house." Marcus said, "Mom, I can't ask you to do that." Ruth said, "You're not asking. I'm deciding." The house sold in 30 days. She moved into the guest room on Sycamore Street with 2 boxes of books, a photograph of Dale, and the ceramic lamp she had bought the year Marcus was born. She had asked for nothing. She had made it easier. And now she was in a parking lot. What Ruth did not know, sitting in the dark of her car with the key in her hand and the supermarket lights on her windshield, was that her grandmother had spent 4 decades making sure this moment would not be the end of anything. Vera Holloway had owned 40 acres of farmland on County Road 7 for 52 years. For 52 years, her family had told her to sell. The land was not producing what it once had. The upkeep was too much for a woman alone. The offers had come in over the years, reasonable offers, and Vera had declined every one of them with a single word and no further discussion. They called her stubborn. They said she was sentimental about land the way old people get sentimental about things that no longer make practical sense. They said she was too old to understand what the land was actually worth. Vera had listened to all of it and said nothing, because Vera had never felt the need to explain herself to people who had already decided they knew better. What none of them understood, what Ruth herself sitting in that parking lot did not yet understand, was that Vera Holloway knew exactly what the land was worth. She had known for a long time. She was simply waiting for the right moment and the right person to come and find it. That person had always been Ruth. She just had not found out yet. Friday came before Ruth was ready for it, which was not unusual. Most difficult things in her life had arrived before she was ready. She had spent Wednesday and Thursday in the guest room with the door closed, going through what she owned with the particular efficiency of a woman who had spent 31 years sorting mail by zip code. Everything had a place, or it did not have a place. If it did not have a place in 2 bags, it did not come with her. She filled 1 bag with clothes. She filled the second with the things that could not be replaced. Dale's watch, the photograph from their first apartment, the small Bible her mother had given her when she was 12, the ceramic lamp that she had bought the year Marcus was born, which she wrapped in a sweater and fit into the corner of the bag with the care you give to something fragile. At the bottom of the second bag, before she zipped it, she placed the key. She had found it at the back of her jewelry box where it had lived for years, beneath a tangle of things she never wore. The braided cord had faded from red to a soft, washed pink. The brass was dark with handling smooth at the teeth from all the years it had spent on her keychain before she moved it to the jewelry box the last time she changed her purse. She held it in her palm for a moment, the way you hold something whose weight is familiar even when you have not felt it in a long time. Vera had given it to her at the Thanksgiving table in 1994. Ruth had been 44 years old. The family was crowded around the table, the usual noise of a holiday gathering, and Vera had reached across and put the key in Ruth's hand without any announcement, as if she were passing the salt. She had said, "That opens the farmhouse. It is your key now, not mine. Mine just happens to look the same." Ruth had laughed and asked what she was supposed to do with it. Vera had said nothing in particular. "Just know it is yours." Ruth had put it on her keychain and thought nothing more of it. When Vera died in 2013, she had moved the key to the jewelry box because she could not bring herself to throw it away, and she did not know what else to do with it. She had not been back to the farm, not once in 12 years. There was no particular reason for that. The farm had passed to the family estate, and then, as far as Ruth understood it, into some unresolved legal situation that no one had ever fully explained to her. She had been grieving, and then she had been busy, and then she had simply not thought about it. She wrapped the key in the dish towel and placed it in the bag, and then took it out again and put it in her coat pocket instead. She did not know why. It was just the key. It seemed wrong to let it ride in a bag. Brenda knocked at 6:30 to ask if she needed help carrying anything down. Ruth said no, thank you. Brenda said of course, and her footsteps went back down the hall, even, and unhurried the footsteps of someone who had resolved a logistical issue and moved on to the next item. Marcus was not home. He had a work thing, Brenda said. He was sorry he could not be there. He had texted Ruth that morning, "Mom, I really am sorry about this. The timing is just really bad with Kevin and everything." Ruth had read it and put the phone in her pocket and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would have been useful. She carried her own bags to the car. The Walmart parking lot on Route 9 was 3 miles from Sycamore Street. She drove there because it was open all night and well lit, and she had no particular place else to go at 9 in the evening on a Tuesday in September. She pulled into a space near the side of the building away from the main entrance, and she turned the engine off and sat for a moment, looking at the fluorescent lights above the entrance throwing their pale wash across the lot. She reclined the seat as far as it would go. She looked at the ceiling of the car. She was not panicking. Ruth Alderman had not been a woman who panicked. She had worked the morning shift at the post office for 31 years, had sorted and delivered through blizzards and heat waves and the deaths of colleagues and the slow diminishment of the service she had given her working life to, and she had not panicked through any of it. She had simply kept moving and done the next thing and trusted that the situation would become manageable if she kept her head. The situation was this. She had $31,000 in her savings account. She had $880 per month from Social Security. The cheapest of the 3 facilities in Brenda's folder was $2,200 a month. She had done this arithmetic already. It was not difficult arithmetic. The conclusion was also not difficult. Marcus texted at 9:47. "Mom, are you okay? Where are you staying tonight?" Ruth looked at the message for a moment. She typed back, "I am fine, don't worry." She put the phone face down on the passenger seat. She lay in the reclined seat and listened to the ambient sounds of the parking lot. The refrigeration units, a car pulling in and pulling out, a cart being returned to the rack near the entrance, its wheels loud in the quiet. She thought about how many times in her life she had sent that exact message. "I am fine, don't worry." She had said it to Dale when his heart was getting worse, and she was managing the house and working full-time and cooking everything from scratch because his diet had to be controlled, and she had not wanted him to feel like a burden. She had said it to Marcus every time he called in his 20s, and she was quietly managing some difficulty she had not told him about. She had said it so many times and in so many circumstances that she could no longer tell with any certainty when she meant it, and when she was simply maintaining the habit of reassurance she had built up over 50 years of making things easier for people. She was not entirely fine. She was also not falling apart. She was somewhere in the particular middle ground that women of her generation learned to occupy, functional and competent and privately without a plan. She thought about the senior living folder on the bed in the guest room. She had left it there. She had not brought it with her. She was not sure whether that was a statement or simply an oversight. She reached into her coat pocket and found the key. She held it in her hand in the dark of the car, the brass warm from her body, the braided cord between her fingers. Vera's farm was on County Road 7 north of Millhaven, 40 acres of fields and tree line that Vera Holloway had worked by herself from the time her husband Ray died in 1971 until the year she turned 90, and her body made the decision for her that her will never would have. The family had been telling her to sell it since Ruth was a teenager. The offers had come in over the decades, and Vera had declined them all with the same word and the same expression, which was the expression of someone who has considered the matter thoroughly and is not interested in considering it again. Ruth had always admired that about her grandmother without entirely understanding it. It had seemed to her that Vera's refusal to sell was a kind of stubbornness, a sentimental attachment to a place that had become more burden than asset. She had thought that privately for years. She had never said it to Vera because Vera was not someone you said that kind of thing to. Now she lay in a Walmart parking lot at 11 o'clock at night with her grandmother's key in her hand and thought about the farm. She had not thought about it as a real place in years. A place she could go. A place that might still be there at the end of County Road 7 with the tree line and the fields and the old farmhouse that Vera had kept in better repair than anyone gave her credit for. The estate had never been fully resolved as far as Ruth knew. No one had ever called her to say the land had been sold. No one had called her about much of anything regarding Vera's estate, and she had been so deep in her own grief and then her own life that she had not pushed. She had assumed someone was handling it. She had assumed it was being handled. She was not sure that assumption had been correct. At some point before midnight, she stopped thinking about the senior living folder. She closed her eyes. The key was still in her hand. In the morning, when the lot began to fill with the early grocery shoppers and the light came in gray and cool through the windshield, Ruth Alderman sat up. She adjusted the seat. She looked at herself briefly in the rearview mirror without particular judgment. She started the car. She drove north. Ruth drove north for 2 hours on roads she had not traveled in 12 years. She stopped once for coffee at a gas station outside of Millhaven, a paper cup from a machine that tasted like nothing in particular, and she drank it in the parking lot, watching the morning come in over the tree line. The sky was the pale gray of early September, not quite overcast, not quite clear, the kind of sky that had not yet decided what it was going to do with the day. She knew the route without thinking about it. The county road that cut north off the state highway, the long straightaway past the grain co-op, the left turn at the old Methodist church that had been there since before her grandmother was born. Her hands knew the turns the way hands know things they learned a long time ago and never quite forgot. The farm appeared the same way it always had, gradually at the end of a gentle rise in the road. The tree line first, and then the roof of the barn, and then the farmhouse itself, white wood frame with green shutters that had gone soft with age. She slowed without meaning to. It was still there. She had half expected it not to be. She had spent 12 years assuming that at some point the estate would resolve itself, and the land would be sold, and the farmhouse would be torn down or renovated into something unrecognizable, and that would be the end of it. She had been waiting for news of that and dreading it, and also in some quiet part of herself, relieved that it had not come yet. Now she sat in her car at the edge of County Road 7 and looked at the white farmhouse in the September morning and felt something move through her chest that she did not try to name. The fields were not overgrown. That was the first thing that did not match what she had expected. The front pasture had been mowed not recently, but within the season the grass cut back and even. The fence line along the road was maintained. She could see from here that 2 of the fence posts were new wood, raw and pale against the older weathered posts around them, replaced recently and set with care. Someone had been here. Someone had been coming here regularly for years by the look of it, and doing the work that land requires when it is being kept rather than abandoned. Ruth parked at the end of the gravel drive and sat for a moment with the engine off. She had been here last in October of 2013, the week of Vera's funeral. She had stood at the end of this same drive in her black coat with Marcus on one side and Dale on the other, and she had looked at the farmhouse and thought, I will come back soon. I will come back and go through her things properly, her kitchen things and her books and the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, and I will do it right. She had not come back. Dale's health had been declining by then, and the care of that had consumed the following years, and then Dale had died, and grief had consumed the years after that, and soon had extended itself into 12 years of absence, without her quite deciding to be absent. She got out of the car. The gravel was the same gravel. She had walked this drive so many times in her childhood and her adult life that her feet knew the sound of it. She walked slowly, not from hesitation, but because the morning was quiet, and she was not yet ready to rush anything. The porch steps were the same steps. She put her foot on the bottom one, and it gave the same creak it had given since she was 9 years old. She had asked Vera once why she never fixed it, and Vera had said, I know it is me coming up the steps. The creak tells me everything is normal. Ruth had thought that was strange reasoning. Now standing on the porch at 74 years old after a night in a parking lot, she understood it completely. She ran her hand along the porch rail. The paint was peeling in places, the wood beneath soft and gray with age. And there, near the corner post, was a small wooden sign she did not remember seeing before. Not a store-bought sign. Handmade, a small rectangle of wood with 2 words painted in careful block letters in the particular way Vera had always printed things precise and unhurried. Still here! Ruth stood looking at it. It was not new. The paint had aged into the wood, the edges of the letters slightly soft with time. Vera had made this. Vera had painted these 2 words on a piece of wood and hung it on her porch rail, and Ruth did not know when and did not know who it was meant for. But standing on the porch of the farmhouse at 7 in the morning, after sleeping in a Walmart parking lot, she felt with complete certainty that it had been meant for her to see. Not because that was a rational thing to feel, because it was simply and plainly true in the way some things are true before you have the language for them. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. She watched it ring. It stopped. Then it rang again. She declined it. A text came through a moment later. Mom, please call me. Brenda feels terrible about how things went. We want to talk. Ruth read it once. She put the phone back in her pocket. She stood on the porch and thought about the sentence, Brenda feels terrible. She thought about the difference between that sentence and I feel terrible for what I did. She had been parsing sentences like that for 2 years, the careful constructions that meant something and also meant nothing. The passive arrangements of language that acknowledged discomfort without accepting cause. She was 74 years old and she was tired. Not of Marcus, not entirely. Just of pretending the difference between those sentences was too fine to notice. She took the key from her coat pocket. The lock was the same lock. The key went in with the slight resistance of a mechanism that had not been turned in some time and then turned cleanly. The door opened. The smell came first. Cedar and old wood, and underneath both of those something fainter and more particular, the lavender that Vera had kept in small bowls on every windowsill for as long as Ruth could remember. It should not have still been there after 12 years. And yet there it was, the ghost of it held in the wood and the plaster the way a house holds the habits of the person who lived in it longest. The furniture was covered in white sheets. The shapes beneath were familiar. The settee by the window, the tall-backed chairs, the bookshelf Vera's husband Ray had built in 1963, and that had never moved from the wall beside the fireplace. The curtains were drawn, but the morning light came through the edges in thin, pale lines. Ruth stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. The kitchen was through the doorway to the right, the same doorway with the same slight drop in the floor where the addition had been built in 1952. She stepped through it. The kitchen table was exactly where it had always been. Centered in the room, 4 chairs, the oilcloth covering that Vera had replaced every few years with something nearly identical to what had been there before. And on the table in the center of it, placed with deliberate precision, was an envelope. Not old, not yellowed, white clean, the kind of envelope that had been kept somewhere dry and protected. And on the front in handwriting she would have known anywhere, in the careful upright letters that Vera Holloway had used for every card and every list and every note she had ever written in her 96 years of life. Ruth. Just that. Just her name? Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway and did not move. Vera had been dead for 12 years. The house had been locked. And on the kitchen table, centered and deliberate as if placed there that morning, was an envelope addressed to Ruth in her grandmother's hand. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, maybe longer. Then she walked to the table and sat down in the chair that had always been hers, the one closest to the window, the one where the morning light came in. She put her hands flat on the table on either side of the envelope. She looked at her name in Vera's handwriting. And she did not open it yet. She was still sitting with her hands flat on either side of the envelope when she heard the boots on the porch steps. The creak of the bottom step, then the second. The particular weight and cadence of someone who had climbed these steps many times before and was not in any hurry. Ruth turned toward the doorway. The man who appeared in the frame of the open door was 68 years old, broad through the shoulders, wearing work pants and a canvas jacket, and a hat that had been through enough seasons to have lost any particular shape. He was holding the hat in his hands when he stepped inside. He looked at Ruth sitting at Vera's kitchen table, and he was not surprised. His expression was the expression of someone who had been expecting this, and was simply glad it had finally come. "He said I figured you would come eventually. Your grandmother said you would." He paused. "I am sorry it took this long." Ruth said Earl Hicks. He nodded. He said, "Yes, ma'am." He looked around the kitchen the way a person looks at a room they know well. Then he pulled out the chair across from Ruth and sat down, setting his hat on the table beside him. He had farmed the land adjacent to Vera's for 30 years. Ruth remembered him from childhood visits, a younger man, then quieter even than Vera, someone who appeared at the fence line occasionally and exchanged a few words with her grandmother about the weather or the soil or whatever needed exchanging, and then disappeared back to his own work. He and Vera had operated on the same frequency she understood now, the frequency of people who do not talk unless they have something to say. He told her about the 12 years. After Vera's funeral, he had kept coming to the property. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody had offered him anything for it. He had mowed the front pasture when it needed mowing and maintained the fence line and replaced the porch boards that had gone soft in the winters and checked the roof and the foundation each spring for damage. He had done this because Vera had asked him to, not recently but years before she died, in the particular matter-of-fact way that Vera asked for things, as if she were simply stating an arrangement that had already been settled. She had told him Ruth would come back when she needed to. She had told him to make sure the place was there when that happened. "Ruth said she told you that." "Earl said she told me that about 6 years before she passed. We were standing out by the back fence looking at the south field. She just said it. Said Ruth will come when she is ready, make sure there is something here for her to come to." Then she went back inside, and that was that. Ruth looked at the envelope on the table. She said, "And the envelope. Earl said she gave that to me the last autumn before she died. Sealed, already addressed. She said to put it somewhere Ruth would see it the moment she walked in." He looked at the center of the table, said she would know what to do with it. "Ruth said you kept it for 12 years. He said I kept it in my house in the fireproof box where I keep my important papers. Brought it over 3 weeks ago." He paused. Something told me the time was getting close. He looked at her directly. "I do not entirely know how to explain that." Ruth did not ask him to explain it. She understood it in the way you understand things that belong to the same category as a creak on the porch step and a sign that says "Still here." Some things do not require explanation. They just require paying attention. She picked up the envelope. The paper was firm and cool, the kind of good envelope that holds its shape. Her name in the center in Vera's handwriting, the letters careful and upright, even now at the end, even in the hand of a woman who had been 95 years old when she wrote it. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. She unfolded it and smoothed it against the table. The handwriting was slower than she remembered. The letters were formed with more effort, the pen pressing harder in some places than others, the way very old hands write when the intention is clear, but the body requires concentration to follow. But it was legible, every word. Ruth, if you are reading this in the kitchen, then you came home? Good. I need to tell you something I should have said out loud years ago. The farm is yours. It has been since 2001. I put your name on the deed, just yours, when you were 51, and I was 83, and I was beginning to understand that I would not be here forever. I did not tell you then because I knew you would worry about the taxes, the upkeep, all the practical things. You have always worried about the practical things. I want you to stop worrying. The land is paid. It is clean. It is yours. Earl Hicks knows where everything is. Carol Dunning at the county office has the paperwork. I love you, Ruth. I always thought you were the strongest one. I just never said it enough. Gran? Ruth read it through once. Then she read it again more slowly, the way you read something when your mind has understood the words, but the rest of you is still catching up. She set the letter down on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. The morning light had moved since she sat down, coming in at a slightly different angle through the window above the sink, the way light moves when time has passed without you noticing. She looked at Earl. He was sitting with his hat on the table and his hands folded, and the particular stillness of someone who has been patient for a long time and is content to be patient a little longer. She said, "Did anyone in the family know?" Earl was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, she understood just being careful with the truth. He said, "Your son Marcus called me about 4 years ago. Said he was doing a review of Vera's estate, trying to get a picture of what she had left behind. Said it had never been properly settled." Ruth said nothing. Earl said, "I told him I was just a neighbor. I did not tell him about the deed or anything Vera had asked me to keep. It did not seem like my information to give under the circumstances." Ruth said, "He never mentioned calling you." Earl said, "No, I did not suppose he had." The sentence sat between them without needing any addition. Ruth looked at the letter again. 23 years. Her name had been on the deed to this land for 23 years, and she had not known. Vera had carried that knowledge alone, had made the decision alone, had planned around it alone, in the particular way that Vera Holloway did everything without consultation and without announcement, and with complete certainty that she was doing the right thing. She thought about what it had cost Vera to keep that quiet. Not much, probably, by Vera's accounting. Vera had never found silence difficult. She had found unnecessary speech difficult. There was a difference, and Vera had understood it her whole life. Then Earl said, "There is one more thing." He reached across the table and touched the edge of the envelope. There was something else in there. Ruth looked inside the envelope. Behind Vera's letter, folded separately, was another piece of paper. Not handwritten, printed on letterhead, crisp and formal. Clearwater Renewable Energy Group. Addressed to owner of record Holloway Farm, 40 acres, County Road 7. Dated 14 months ago. Ruth said, "Where did this come from?" Earl said, "Came to the mailbox about a year ago. I brought it in and read enough to understand what it was. Kept it in the envelope." He paused. "I think you should read the whole thing." Ruth looked at the letterhead. She read the first paragraph. Then she stopped. She read it again. She set it face down on the table and looked at Earl across the kitchen, where Vera had cooked 10,000 meals and kept lavender on every windowsill, and told Ruth exactly once that the farm would be hers, and then said nothing more about it for the rest of her life. She said, "Earl, how much land do the farms around here have?" Earl said, "Not much anymore. Most of it got sold off over the years, parceled out or developed." He paused. "Vera's 40 acres is about the only large unbroken parcel left in this corridor." Ruth turned the letter back over. She finished reading it. Then she sat very still for a long time. Ruth read the Clearwater letter a second time with her hands flat on the table and the kitchen quiet around her. The proposal was formal and specific, the language of people who had drafted many such letters and knew how to make large numbers sound routine. Clearwater Renewable Energy Group was developing a solar corridor through the county part of a regional green energy initiative, and the Holloway Farm's 40 acres represented a critical segment of that corridor. The lease terms were $1,900 per acre per year, 25-year term with a signing bonus of $40,000 upon execution. Ruth did the arithmetic the way she had done arithmetic her whole life, carefully and without rushing. $76,000 per year for 25 years. She set the letter down and looked at the number she had written in the margin of her mind, and then looked at it again, because the first time had not quite settled. $1.9 million over the term of the lease. The letter noted this was their third attempt at contact. Previous correspondence had gone unanswered. They requested a response within 60 days before pursuing alternative routing for the corridor. Ruth looked at Earl. She said, "Did Gran know about this?" The solar project, the corridor? Earl was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands on the table. Then he said no. She passed before any of this got started. The energy companies began looking at this corridor maybe 7-8 years ago. He paused. But she used to say something. He looked out the window at the front pasture, the maintained fence line, the fields that he had kept in order for 12 years for a woman who had been dead for 12 years because she had asked him to. She used to say, "Earl, you watch. Someday somebody is going to want this stretch of nothing more than they have ever wanted anything. That is why I am keeping it." Ruth looked at him. He said, "I always thought she was just being stubborn." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have known better." Ruth sat with that. She thought about the word stubborn, how often it had been applied to Vera, how easily it had explained her away for decades. Stubborn about the land, stubborn about not selling, too old and too sentimental and too stubborn to understand what the land was worth. The family had operated on that explanation for so long that no one had thought to question it. Vera had understood exactly what the land was worth. She had understood it before anyone else was looking, in the way that people understand things when they have been paying close attention to the same piece of ground for 50 years and have learned to read it the way other people read weather. Ruth got up from the table. She moved through the farmhouse slowly, not looking for anything particular, just looking. The covered furniture in the sitting room, the shapes beneath the sheets familiar and strange at once. The narrow hallway with the same wallpaper, small blue flowers on shreem that had been there since before Ruth was born. The bathroom with the clawfoot tub that Vera had refused to replace because she said modern tubs were too shallow. The door to the back bedroom, which she pushed open gently. Vera's room. The bed was made. Earl had done that, she supposed, at some point in the 12 years, had come in and smoothed the coverlet and left the room as close to what it had been as he could manage. The dresser with the oval mirror, the nightstand with the small lamp, and on the nightstand the almanac. It was a farmer's almanac, the kind that came every year, but this one was old, the cover worn soft. And when Ruth picked it up, she understood that it was not from any single year. Vera had kept using the same almanac, had tucked the New Year's calendar pages into the back and continued her own notes in the margins and on the blank pages at the end. It was a decade or more of Vera's observations all in one volume. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The early pages were what she expected. Planting notes, weather observations, records of what the South Field had done in a given season and what the soil had needed. Vera's handwriting from those years was firm and quick, the hand of someone who wrote as fast as she thought. She turned to the back pages. The notes there were different, not about the farm, about Ruth. They were in a smaller hand, written with more care, dated and brief. Ruth's retirement, 2004. Ruth's 25th anniversary, which Vera had marked with 2 words, "Good man." The year Dale's health started declining, the year Marcus expanded the business, which Vera had noted without commentary, just the fact and the year. The year Dale died, which Vera had marked with a small cross and nothing else. And then on the last page, in a different pen and a slightly steadier hand, as if Vera had sat down deliberately to write this and taken her time. Marcus asked R for money this year. She will say yes. She always says yes. Below that in the same hand, R still has not called about the deed. She does not know. Leave it. She will find it when she needs it. V. The date beside it was 2012, 1 year before Vera died. Ruth sat on the edge of Vera's bed with the almanac in her hands and read those 2 sentences until they stopped being words and became something else. Her grandmother had been watching her life from a distance for years, quietly without being asked, marking the milestones and the losses and the slow accumulation of what Ruth was carrying. She had known about Marcus asking for money before it happened. She had known Ruth would say yes. She had known that Ruth did not know about the deed, and had decided not to tell her, and had written down the reason in 2 plain sentences and left it in the back of an almanac in a bedroom in a locked farmhouse for 12 years. She will find it when she needs it. Ruth pressed her hand flat against the page. Outside, she could hear Earl moving on the porch, giving her the time she needed the way he had given Vera time for 30 years, without being asked and without making an event of it. She turned back through the almanac, slowly reading the small entries, and between 2 pages near the middle she felt the stiffness of something tucked there, and she opened to it. A business card. White plain, the kind of card that means what it says and nothing extra. A woman's name, Carol Dunning. County Recorder's Office, certified land attorney. Below that, an address and a phone number. Ruth turned it over. On the back, in Vera's handwriting, 2 sentences in pencil. Carol knows. Trust her. She has been waiting, too. Ruth held the card in both hands for a moment. Then she set the almanac on the nightstand where she had found it, and she stood up and went back to the kitchen. Earl was at the table when she came in. He looked at her, and she showed him the card without explanation. He nodded once slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already understood. She said, "Did you know about Carol Dunning?" He said Vera mentioned her, said she had taken care of the legal side, and that Carol would take care of it the rest of the way when the time came. He paused. She trusted that woman a good deal. Ruth looked at the card again. Then she looked at the Clearwater letter on the table. Then she looked out the window at the 40 acres that had been in her name for 23 years, while she had been giving away her house and sleeping in parking lots and reading folders about senior living facilities. She thought about Marcus driving up here alone the year Vera died, walking the property, telling Earl he was assessing estate assets, and then leaving and never coming back, and never saying a word to Ruth about any of it. He had looked at Vera's 40 acres and seen nothing worth the effort. He had been wrong. In the same way everyone had always been wrong about Vera. In the same way he had been wrong about Ruth. That was the thing about people who had been underestimating the women in this family for generations. They kept using the same eyes and kept arriving at the same wrong conclusions and never once considered that the error might be in the looking. Ruth took out her phone. She dialed the number on the back of the card. It rang twice. A woman answered. Her voice was clear and unhurried, the voice of someone who had been at this work for a long time and had made her peace with its pace. Ruth said, "My name is Ruth Alderman. Vera Holloway was my grandmother." There was a pause. Not a surprised pause, a pause of a different kind, the pause of someone setting something down that they have been holding for a long time. Then Carol Dunning said, "Mrs. Alderman, I have had your file on my desk for 12 years. Vera told me you would call when you were ready." She paused again. "I will be honest with you. I wondered sometimes, but I kept the file." "Are you at the farm right now?" Ruth said yes. Carol said, "Stay there. I will come to you." Carol Dunning arrived 50 minutes after the phone call, which told Ruth something about how seriously she had been taking the file for 12 years. She came in a sensible sedan parked at the end of the gravel drive and walked up to the farmhouse with the unhurried stride of a woman who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had stopped performing urgency about them. She was 59 years old, with gray at her temples and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a file folder under her arm that had the worn edges of something that had been opened and closed many times over many years. She shook Ruth's hand at the door, and then shook Earl's hand and said it was good to see him again, and Earl said likewise, and the 3 of them went inside to Vera's kitchen table. Carol set the folder down and opened it. She said, "Let me show you what Vera put in place. Then we can talk about where things stand now." The deed was on top. A single-page official stamped with the county seal dated March 14, 2001. Transfer of ownership 100% Holloway Farm, 40 acres County Road 7 from Vera Mae Holloway to Eleanor Ruth Alderman. Consideration $1 and natural love and affection. Ruth looked at her full legal name on the document. Eleanor Ruth. Nobody called her Eleanor. Vera had always called her Ruth, same as everyone else. But she had used the full name on the deed, the name that appeared on Ruth's birth certificate and her passport and every legal document she had ever signed, as if Vera had wanted to be certain there was no ambiguity, no room for anyone to suggest the wrong person had been named. Carol said it was recorded with the county the same week it was executed. There is no gap, no question of timing, nothing to contest. She turned to the next page. Property taxes. Vera had established an account at First County Bank in March of 2001, the same month she recorded the deed. She had funded it with a lump sum and set up automatic payment of the property taxes for a term of 20 years, with instructions to the bank that were as precise as everything else Vera had arranged. The account still carried a balance of $4,200. Carol said she calculated what 20 years of taxes would cost at the then current rate with a reasonable margin for increases. She was within $300 of exact. She paused. "I have been doing land law for 30 years, Mrs. Alderman. I have not seen that level of preparation more than twice." Ruth looked at the bank statement. She thought about Vera in 2001, 83 years old, sitting down with a calculator and working out 20 years of tax payments to the dollar and preloading an account so that the land would stay clean and paid regardless of what happened. Not because Vera had expected anything in particular to happen, just because she understood that clean land was worth more than complicated land, and she had wanted to give Ruth something with no strings attached and no obligations following it. She thought about the word stubborn. She thought about how many times she had heard it applied to her grandmother, how easily it had served as an explanation, and how completely wrong it had been. Earl got up and put the kettle on without being asked. The kitchen settled into the quiet of people who are in the presence of something significant and are letting it be significant. Then Carol said, "I need to tell you about a phone call I received 4 years ago." She said it without particular emphasis, the way she said everything as a matter of fact that needed to be in the record. A man had called the county recorder's office identifying himself as Marcus Alderman. He said he was conducting a review of his grandmother Vera Holloway's estate holdings in the county. He wanted to know what real property had been in Vera's name at the time of her death. Carol had looked up the record. The Holloway farm was not in Vera's estate. It had been transferred out in 2001, 12 years before Vera died. Carol had told Marcus there was a recorded transfer for that parcel, but that she could only release the ownership details to the current owner of record or their authorized representative. Marcus had asked who the current owner was. Carol had said she could not disclose that without authorization. Marcus had said he would follow up. He had not followed up. Carol looked at Ruth across the table. She said he was 4 minutes from the answer. The follow-up would have been a standard authorization form and a return call. She paused. He did not send the form. Ruth was quiet. She thought about Marcus driving up to this farm the year Vera died, walking the fields, talking to Earl, deciding it was not worth pursuing. She thought about him making one phone call 4 years ago and not following up. She thought about the folder of senior living facilities that Brenda had slid across the kitchen table and the way Brenda's hands had been smooth and certain on the surface of it, and the words, "We thought you understood. That was not permanent." Ruth said in the voice of someone closing a door that had already been closed before anyone announced it. "Carol said your grandmother was very specific with me about how to handle inquiries," she said, and Carol looked down at her notes briefly. She said, "Do not make it easy for anyone who is not Ruth. The ones who deserve it will work for it. Ruth will work for it. The others will not bother." The kettle reached a boil. Earl poured without asking and set cups in front of the three of them and sat back down. Ruth wrapped her hands around the cup. She said, "What about the Clearwater letter?" Carol said she had already been in contact with Clearwater as a courtesy, anticipating this conversation. The 60-day response window on the third letter was still open. 22 days remained. The proposal stood. She opened to a tabbed section near the back of the folder and turned it toward Ruth. A counter-proposal already drafted the language precise and clean. $2,100 per acre rather than $1,900 with a cost of living escalation clause built into the annual payment. Carol said she had drafted it on spec, waiting for Ruth to appear. She said Clearwater's regional director had indicated verbally that adjusted terms would be accepted. The corridor required this specific parcel. There was no alternative routing. The project could not proceed without the Holloway farm. Ruth did the arithmetic. $84,000 per year. She looked at the figure for a moment. Then she said, "Gran knew, didn't she?" She didn't know about the solar project specifically, but she knew the land would matter. Carol looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was close to one, the expression of someone who has been holding a piece of information for a long time and is finally permitted to set it down. She said, "The day we recorded the deed in 2001, your grandmother sat in my office for a few minutes after the paperwork was done. She was 83 years old. She had driven herself to my office, and she was going to drive herself home. She said to me, 'I do not know exactly why yet, but this land is going to matter, and Ruth is going to need it to matter at exactly the right time.'" Ruth looked out the window at the front pasture. The maintained fence lined the fields that Earl had kept for 12 years because a woman who was gone had asked him to, and he had understood that some requests do not expire. She thought about Vera in 1978, the year Ray died, choosing not to sell. She thought about Vera in 1994, pressing a key into Ruth's hand at a Thanksgiving table and saying, "Only yours too, if you need it." She thought about Vera in 2001 sitting in a county attorney's office at 83 years old and saying, "This land is going to matter, and Ruth is going to need it to matter at exactly the right time," and then driving herself home and not mentioning it for the remaining 12 years of her life. Vera had not been stubborn. Vera had been right. Those were not the same thing, and the difference between them was the distance between what the family had seen and what had actually been there. Carol reached into the back of the folder and took out one more item. A plain white envelope sealed the paper, slightly yellowed at the edges with age. On the front, in Vera's handwriting, "For Ruth when she finally gets here." Carol said she gave me this the day we recorded the deed. She said you would know what it meant when you read it. She said she was sorry she never said it out loud. Ruth took the envelope. She held it in both hands, the weight of it familiar in a way that had no logical explanation. The same way the key had been familiar, the same way the creak of the porch step had been familiar, the same way the smell of lavender in a locked house had been familiar. Some things carry the weight of the person who last touched them, and you feel it in your hands before you understand it in your mind. She looked at the kitchen around her, the table where she had sat as a child, shelling beans with Vera on summer afternoons, the window where the morning light came in at an angle that had not changed in 60 years, the covered chairs, the familiar shapes, the faint trace of lavender still present after 12 years, because Vera had kept it on every windowsill for so long that it had become part of the house itself. She thought about Marcus making one phone call and not following up. She thought about Brenda's hands sliding the folder across the table, smooth and certain and final. She thought about Tuesday night in a Walmart parking lot with a key in her coat pocket and nowhere particular to go. She looked at Carol. She said, "I need to make one call before I read this." Carol waited. "Ruth said I need to call my son." Ruth called Marcus at 11 in the morning from Vera's kitchen table, with Carol sitting across from her, and Earl visible through the window moving slowly along the fence line the way he did when he was giving people room. Marcus answered on the third ring. His voice had the careful quality it got when he knew something was coming and was not sure what shape it would take. She did not begin with what she knew. She asked one question. She said, "Marcus, did you ever look into what Gran Vera left behind after she passed?" A pause. Then he said, "I made some calls years back. Nothing came of it. The estate seemed tied up, and I let it go." Ruth said, "I am at the farm right now. I am sitting at Gran's kitchen table." The pause this time was longer. She said, "I need you to come up here, not Brenda, just you, tomorrow if you can." He came at 10 the next morning. Ruth watched his car come up County Road 7 from the kitchen window, the same window where Vera had watched the road for 60 years. She watched him park at the end of the gravel drive and get out slowly. He stood for a moment looking at the farmhouse, at the maintained fields, at Earl's truck parked at the side of the property. He was looking at it the way a person looks at something they had decided was one thing and are now understanding might have been another thing entirely. He came inside without knocking, which was right. You did not knock at a farmhouse where family was waiting. Carol was at the table. The file was open. Ruth had made coffee, and there were 3 cups, and the morning light was coming in through the window at the angle it had always come in, and the kitchen smelled of coffee, and old wood, and the faint trace of lavender that 12 years had not entirely erased. Marcus sat down. Carol presented the facts in the order they occurred, the way she had been presenting facts for 30 years, without theater and without pause for reaction. The deed executed March 2001. Ruth's full legal name, $1, and natural love and affection. The tax account pre-funded 20 years of payments calculated to the dollar. The Clearwater proposal, the counter-proposal, the 22 days remaining in the response window. The revised terms, $84,000 per year, 25-year lease escalation clause. Marcus read through each document carefully. He read the deed twice. He looked at the tax account statement for a long moment. He read the Clearwater letter and the counter-proposal and set them both down and looked at the table. He was quiet for a long time. When he looked up, he did not ask about the money. He said, "How long have you known?" Ruth said 2 days. He said, "She never told you." Ruth said, "No, she trusted me to find it when I needed it." Marcus looked at the table again. Then he said, "I called the county recorder's office 4 years ago. They told me there was a recorded transfer, but they would not tell me whose name the deed was in." Ruth said, "I know." He said if they had told me. Ruth said quietly, "They could not tell you, Marcus, because it was not your name." The sentence went into the room and stayed there. Marcus sat with it. She watched him sit with it, watched him follow it back through the years, the way you follow a thread when you finally pick up the right end of it. Back through the phone call he had not followed up. Back through the farm he had driven up to alone the year Vera died, and walked and assessed and decided was not worth pursuing. Back through Tuesday evening and the folder of senior living facilities and the room that had been made Kevin's. Back through 2 years of guest room and groceries and the house she had sold without being asked, because he had come to her with numbers, and she had been the kind of woman who made things easier, and he had been the kind of man who had allowed that without asking what it cost her. All of it was in that sentence. It was not your name. There was no version of the accounting where he came out on the right side, and he was smart enough to know it, and Ruth could see him knowing it, and she did not look away. He said, "Mom, I am sorry about Tuesday. About all of it. I did not think about." Ruth said, "I know you did not think about it. That is what I need you to understand. You did not think about it." She said it without anger. She had moved through the anger somewhere between the parking lot and the farmhouse, somewhere on the 2-hour drive north on roads her hands remembered. What was left was not anger. It was clarity, the particular clarity that comes from sleeping in a car with a key in your hand and then sitting for 2 days in your grandmother's kitchen reading documents that prove someone had been thinking about you for 23 years while you were busy not asking for anything from anyone. She said, "I am going to sign the Clearwater lease, I am going to fix up the farmhouse, and I am going to live in it." She looked at him steadily. "I do not need anything from you, Marcus. Not now, possibly, not ever. But I would like it if you came to visit sometimes. If you can manage that." She paused. "Without Brenda telling you what to say before you walk in the door." Marcus looked at his hands on the table. He nodded once. It was not a large gesture. It was the gesture of a man who has run out of other gestures and is left with only the plain one. He stayed another hour. They talked about the farmhouse repairs, the practical things, the timeline for the lease. Carol answered his questions directly and without edge. Earl came in at one point for coffee and shook Marcus's hand, and the two of them stood for a moment looking out the window at the south field in the way that men stand when they are in the presence of something neither of them knows how to say. At noon, Marcus said he needed to get back. Ruth walked him to the door. He stood on the porch for a moment looking at the sign on the rail. The 2 words in Vera's careful block printing. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Ruth and did not say anything. She did not fill the silence for him. She had been filling silences for people her whole life, and she was going to be more careful about that from now on. He went down the steps and got in his car. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched him go down the gravel drive, watched the car reach County Road 7 and turn south, watched it diminish down the straight road until it was a shape, and then not a shape anymore. Then she went back inside. Carol had gone. Earl was somewhere on the property doing what Earl did, which was whatever needed doing. The kitchen was quiet, and the afternoon light was coming in through the window, and the coffee was still warm in the pot. Ruth sat down at Vera's table. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the sealed envelope. She had been carrying it since Carol gave it to her, the way she had carried the key on Tuesday night against her body in the pocket closest to her hand. The paper had warmed to her temperature. Her name on the front in Vera's writing, the ink slightly faded, the letters still clear. For Ruth when she finally gets here. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. She unfolded it. Vera's handwriting from 2001, the year she had walked into Carol Dunning's office at 83 years old and signed over 40 acres to her granddaughter for $1 and natural love and affection, and then driven herself home without mentioning it to anyone. The handwriting was firm. This was Vera before the slowness came. Vera in her 80s still, which meant Vera at the height of her particular power, which had always been the power of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had stopped needing anyone else to understand it. Ruth read it once. Then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest with both hands, the way she had held the key on Tuesday night in the Walmart parking lot, the way you hold something that has found you after traveling a long distance. She did not cry. She did something she had not done in a very long time, had not done since before Dale got sick, had not done in years that she could not now count exactly. She laughed, quietly, completely alone at her grandmother's table in the afternoon light with the smell of lavender in the air, and 40 acres outside the window that had been hers for 23 years. Because Vera Holloway, who had lived 96 years without explaining herself to a single person who did not deserve the explanation, had written exactly 3 sentences in her final letter to Ruth. 3 sentences in the firm hand of a woman who had farmed 40 acres alone and pre-funded 20 years of tax payments and transferred a deed for $1 and said nothing about any of it for the rest of her life. And they were the 3 most perfectly right sentences anyone had ever said to Ruth Alderman in 74 years. Ruth was staying at a friend's place on the edge of town, a spare room with a window that faced west. And she had been there long enough to know the way the afternoon light moved across the wall and the sound the furnace made when it came on at night. It was not uncomfortable. It was temporary in the way that everything felt temporary now, which was not entirely unpleasant, the feeling of a woman who has stopped pretending that the arrangements she is living in are permanent when they are not. She had spoken to Carol twice. The Clearwater negotiation was moving forward, the revised terms accepted verbally, the formal paperwork being prepared. She had spoken to Earl once briefly about a section of fence on the north side that needed attention before winter. She had spoken to Marcus once more, a short call, practical about her forwarding address. His voice had been different from the voice he had used before the meeting at Carol's office, quieter and more careful, the voice of a man who is still finding his way around something that has changed the shape of the room he thought he knew. She had not yet decided when to give the grandchildren the cassette. She had been carrying that decision the way she had carried the key on the night she slept in the Walmart parking lot, in the pocket closest to her hand present and not yet ready. She knew the 4 of them, Marcus's 2, Brenda's 2, all of them old enough to hear what Harold had to say, and young enough that what he said might still do something when it landed. She knew Harold had understood that distinction when he sat down in front of the recorder in 2015. He had not recorded the message for Marcus. He had not recorded it for Diane. He had recorded it for the generation that had not yet hardened into its final shape. On a Saturday morning in late October, she called them. All 4. She kept it simple. She said she had something that belonged to their great-grandfather and that he had left it for them specifically, and she would like them to come to the farmhouse on Sunday if they could manage it. She said she would make lunch. She did not tell them what it was. They came. All 4 of them, which told her something about the 4 of them, that when their grandmother called and said come, they came without requiring more explanation than that. Marcus's oldest, Connor, drove 2 hours. Diane's daughter Sophie brought her younger brother Caleb. They arrived within 20 minutes of each other and stood in the farmhouse kitchen where Ruth had set out food, and the old cassette recorder sat on the table in the center of everything small and black and unremarkable to look at. They looked at it with the expression young people have when they encounter technology from before their time, a mix of recognition and distance, the way you look at something that belongs to a world you know existed but did not inhabit. Ruth told them what it was. She told them that their great-grandfather Harold had recorded something in 2015 and had asked that it be given to them when the time was right. She told them it was for them and not for their parents, which she said plainly without making it larger than it was, because Harold had been a plain man, and she thought he would have wanted it said plainly. She said, "I'm going to start it, and then I'm going to go outside for a while. This is yours." She pressed play. She went out to the porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind her and stood in the October morning with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and listened to the silence inside the house, which was not quite silence because Harold's voice was in it, though she could not make out the words from where she stood. She did not need to make out the words. She had listened to the recording once alone in Carol's office with the recorder in her lap and the afternoon going gray outside the window. She had listened to her father-in-law's voice older than she had last heard it, slower, the voice of a man who had chosen every word with the understanding that these would be the words that remained. She had listened, and she had understood why he had addressed it to the grandchildren and not to Marcus or Diane, because Marcus and Diane had already become who they were going to be, and Harold had understood that, and he had done the thing he could do, which was to speak to the ones who were still in the process of becoming. He had said their grandmother had raised her children alone from the time she was very young. He had said she had never complained and never asked for help and never once done anything that was not worthy of respect. He had said he was leaving what he had to Ruth because that was the right thing, and he had said he wanted them to know one thing about the woman who was their grandmother, which was that she had never in her life been anything less than exactly what a person should be. He had said, "If anyone in this family has treated her as less than that, I hope you will remember what I just told you. You do not have to do anything large about it. Just remember." Ruth stood on the porch and drank her coffee, and the October morning was cold and still around her, and the 40 acres lay quiet in the late autumn light, the fields Earl had kept for 12 years, the fence line with the 2 new posts, the farmhouse standing exactly as it had stood for the 52 years Vera had refused to sell it. After about 20 minutes, the door opened behind her. It was Connor, Marcus's oldest, 22 years old, with Harold's eyes that Ruth had noticed when he was a baby and had not stopped noticing. He came out onto the porch and stood beside her and did not say anything immediately, which was right, which told her something about who he was becoming. Then he said, "Grandma, do you need a place to stay? You can stay with me. I have a couch that folds out. It's not much, but it's there." Ruth looked at him. 22 years old and 2 hours from home and standing on his great-grandmother's porch, making an offer he did not have to make the first person in the family to make the offer without being asked and without calculating what it would cost him. She said, "I have my own place coming, sweetheart, but thank you." She meant it completely. He nodded. He looked out at the fields. He said she sounds like she was something. Great-great-grandma Vera. Ruth said she was. He said the way he talked about you. His voice got different. Ruth said Harold was not a man who said things easily. When he said them, he meant them entirely. Connor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know." "About the house? About what Dad asked you to do?" Ruth said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I'm sorry." She looked at him. The apology was genuine, the apology of a young man who has just understood something about his family that he had not understood before, and is deciding in real time what kind of person he wants to be about it. It was the most important kind of apology, the kind that comes before the person has been asked for it. She put her hand on his arm briefly. She said, "Go back inside with your cousins. I'll be in a minute." "He went!" Ruth stood on the porch a moment longer. She thought about Harold in 2015, 82 years old, sitting alone in whatever room he had chosen, speaking to grandchildren he would not live to see, grow fully into themselves, trusting that the words would find them when they were ready to receive them. He had trusted Ruth to know when that was. she had known. That evening, after the grandchildren had gone, Ruth sat at Vera's kitchen table alone and thought about what Harold had said. Not the words to the grandchildren, but the fact of the recording itself, the decision a quiet man had made to sit down in front of a machine and say the things he had not found a way to say in person. Harold Marsh had never been a man of speeches. He had expressed himself through what he built and what he planned and what he set aside in locked drawers for people he loved. But he had found a way. The way he always found a way, which was quietly and without announcing that he was doing it, and with complete trust that the person he was doing it for would be there when it mattered. Ruth's phone rang at 8:15 the next morning. She looked at the screen. Diane? Not a forwarded message, not a group call with Marcus, just Diane alone on a Sunday morning calling without a script. Ruth answered. She said, Diane. A long silence, the kind of silence that has been prepared for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment it was being prepared for. Then Diane's voice, smaller than its usual register, smaller than Ruth had heard it since Diane was very young and still learning how to ask for things. She said, Mom, I am sorry. The farmhouse was ready by the first week of April. Dale had replaced the porch boards that had gone soft over the winter, re-insulated the walls, repaired the kitchen pipes that had been waiting for attention since Vera stopped being able to attend to them herself. He had done the work in the same economical way. He did everything without commentary, without suggestion about what Ruth might want to change or update or modernize. She had not wanted to change or update or modernize. She had wanted it sound and warm and as close to what it had always been as the years would allow. She moved in on a Saturday in early April with the same 2 bags she had left Marcus's house with in September. She could have rented an apartment now. She could have bought one. The Clearwater signing bonus had arrived in February, and the first quarterly payment had come in March, and the arithmetic of her life had rearranged itself into something she was still getting used to reading, a set of numbers that meant she could go anywhere and do almost anything, and that what she was choosing, therefore, was this: Vera's kitchen, Vera's porch, the window that faced east and caught the morning light before anything else caught it, the creak of the bottom porch step that still said everything is normal, same as it always did. She unpacked her 2 bags and put things where they belonged and made coffee and sat at the table and looked out the window at the 40 acres in the pale April morning and felt something she did not try to name. Some feeling that was not triumph, and not relief and not grief, though it had elements of all 3. The feeling of a thing that has arrived after a long journey and set itself down where it was always supposed to be. Earl came by most mornings. He came without announcing himself, which was how he had come to Vera's farm for 30 years, and Ruth had stopped expecting announcement after the first week. He would appear at the fence line or the porch, or occasionally just in the kitchen doorway, and they would have coffee and talk about what the land needed, and then he would go do some part of it, and Ruth would watch from the window or come out and ask questions. He was teaching her things she had not known to learn, what the fields looked like after a good winter, the way the soil showed itself in spring where the drainage ran after a hard rain, and why Vera had planted the east pasture the way she had, which had seemed arbitrary until Earl explained the slope, where the old fence line had been and what it had been protecting, which turned out to be more than Ruth had understood. He told her Vera used to say the land teaches you if you stay still long enough to listen. Ruth was staying still. She was listening. She was not good at it yet, not in the way Vera had been good at it, but she was 74 years old and she had time, and she had 40 acres, and she had Earl, who had infinite patience for teaching things to people who were genuinely trying to learn. In the East Quarter, the Clearwater installation began in late April. The crew arrived on a Monday morning in 2 trucks and a flatbed, and they were efficient and quiet and respectful of the property in the way that people are respectful when they understand they are guests on someone else's land. Ruth watched the first day from the porch with her coffee. She watched the panels go in row by row, steady and orderly, and she thought about Vera saying someday somebody is going to want this stretch of nothing more than they have ever wanted anything. She thought about the family calling it a stretch of nothing for 52 years, calling Vera stubborn for keeping it, calling her sentimental and too old to understand. She thought about Marcus walking these fields in 2013 and deciding they were not worth pursuing. She thought about Tuesday night in September, a parking lot, a reclined seat, a key in her coat pocket, and nowhere else to go. She drank her coffee. She did not feel triumphant. She felt settled, which was something she was coming to understand was better than triumphant. Triumphant implied a contest. What had happened was not a contest. What had happened was a woman who had been paying attention for 50 years and a granddaughter who had finally come home to read what she had written. In May, Ruth planted a garden. She put it on the south side of the house, which was where Vera had kept her garden for 60 years, the same south-facing plot with the same drainage and the same morning light. She did not entirely know what she was doing. She bought the wrong seeds twice, realizing her error only when Earl looked at the packets with the polite expression of someone who is deciding whether to say something. She killed 2 rows of beans through a combination of overwatering and a late cold snap she had not accounted for. The 3rd row she planted in June later than she should have in soil. She had amended with Earl's guidance, and she gave it less attention than the first 2 rows, because she had learned from the first 2 rows that her attention was not always helpful. On the morning the first shoots came up, she stood in the garden for a long time looking at them. Small green, crooked in the particular way of new growth that has not yet found its direction. She crouched down and looked at them at close range and felt something move through her that she understood was not about beans. She went inside. She sat at Vera's table. She got a piece of paper from the drawer where Vera had always kept paper, and she wrote a letter. She wrote to Vera. She told her about Marcus and the parking lot and Carol Dunning's 12-year file and the 3 sentences. She told her about the signing and the spring and Earl teaching her to read the drainage. She told her about the wrong seeds and the dead beans and the row that finally grew. She wrote for a long time, longer than she had expected, because once she started, she found there was a great deal she had been meaning to say to Vera for a long time and had never quite gotten to. At the end, she wrote, "I understand now why you never explained yourself." Explaining would have made it smaller. You let it be the size it actually was. I am trying to learn how to do that. She folded the letter and took Vera's almanac from the nightstand in the back bedroom and opened it to the last page after Vera's last entry, the one dated 2012. She tucked the letter there. Then she put the almanac back on the nightstand where it belonged. Marcus came in June. He came alone, as Ruth had asked, without calling ahead, which was new for him. He pulled up the gravel drive on a Saturday morning and got out of the car and stood looking at the farmhouse the way he had stood looking at it in September, but differently. In September, he had been reassessing. Now he was simply looking the way you look at something you have begun to understand you missed. Earl was at the fence line when Marcus arrived. Ruth watched them shake hands from the kitchen window and then walk the property together. Earl pointing at things, Marcus listening, both of them moving, at the pace the land required, which was not fast. She made coffee and waited. When Marcus came back inside and sat down, he said, "It is beautiful up here, Mom." He looked at the kitchen, at the morning light through the window, at the solar panels visible in the east field. He said, "I do not know why I never came when Gran was alive." Ruth said you were busy. He said that is not a good enough reason. She said no, but it is the one you had. They sat at Vera's table for 2 hours. They talked about Dale, about the years of his illness and what that had been like for Ruth in ways she had not described to Marcus at the time, because she had been managing, and managing did not leave room for description. They talked about Vera, about what Ruth remembered from childhood visits, about the things Marcus had not known, because he had been a boy who grew into a man without asking the older women in his family what their lives had actually cost them. They talked about some things that had been set aside for years, because there was always something more pressing, and it turned out that when you removed the more pressing things, there was quite a lot that had simply been waiting. When Marcus left, he stood in the doorway and hugged her, not the brief, careful hug of a man performing a social obligation, a real one, the kind that acknowledges that something has shifted and is not going to shift back. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched his car go down the gravel drive for the second time. She watched it reach County Road 7 and turn south. It felt different this time. She went back inside and poured the last of the coffee and took it out to the porch. The June evening was warm and still. The fields were green, the good green of late spring, and the solar panels in the east quarter caught the low light and held it in a way that was not unbeautiful. Somewhere at the back of the property, Earl's truck was visible at the tree line where he had been doing something with the old fence posts all afternoon. The garden on the south side of the house had its third row coming in. Ruth sat in the porch chair and looked at her 40 acres and drank her coffee. Vera Holloway had been told for 52 years that she was being stubborn. What she had actually been was patient. She had been waiting for a Tuesday night in September when her granddaughter would have nowhere to go and a key in her hand and 40 acres to come home to. She could not have predicted that exact Tuesday. But she had understood something about Ruth that Ruth had never quite understood about herself. That the woman who makes everything easier for everyone who sells her house without being asked who drives to a parking lot rather than cause inconvenience, that woman is not fragile. That woman is the strongest person in the room. She just had not had a farm to prove it. Vera had given her the farm. Ruth had given herself the rest. The evening light went slowly off the fields, the green going soft and gray as the sun dropped behind the tree line. Ruth sat until the light was nearly gone, and then she sat a little longer because there was nowhere she needed to be, and nothing she needed to do, and no one whose convenience she needed to arrange herself around. Her hand rested on the porch rail beside the small wooden sign Vera had made, and hung there at some point in the years before she died in her careful block, printing 2 words that were not a welcome sign, and not a decoration, and not an explanation. Just a quiet statement of fact from a woman who had never needed to explain herself to anyone. Still here. Ruth looked at her own hand beside it on the rail. She thought yes. Still here.